Hello, welcome to the final session in this two-part series on using program data to reduce recidivism. My name is Derek Mueller, and I'm a Senior Research Analyst for the Utah Criminal Justice Center in the College of Social Work at the University of Utah. Today, I'll be presenting alongside one of my colleagues, Jessica Seawright. And first, I'd like to circle back and thank my colleagues, Christian Sarver and Jessica Seawright, for the informative introductory presentation that we had on this topic 2 weeks ago. I'd also like to thank all of those returning today for today's session and welcome any new audience members that are attending for the first time today. For any newcomers, I will provide a brief summary of the key points that were discussed during the first session, just to kind of establish what some of the key points that were talked about during that. And then hopefully sets the tone for the discussion that follows later following that. So with that being said, I'm going to share my screen. Got to put together a couple of slides for today. All right, so hopefully everyone can see the slides. So again, I'm worked with Christian Sarver, Jessica Seawright on building out this two-part series. And the idea is that we're hoping that data can be used to help track treatment and treatment-related outcomes, and hopefully that can be used to inform what we know about recidivism. So just as a quick recap here, what we know based on the research on risk-need responsivity model is that risk level should drive treatment dosage, intensity, and then obviously treatment decisions in general. What we would expect is that high-risk individuals are receiving more intensive services than moderate risk, as well as low risk. And then for moderate and low risk, they shouldn't be receiving more intensive services than high-risk individuals. So one of the key points to really kind of building out this presentation was first to kind of think about what the R&R model is telling us and how we can use that to inform the information that we're using or tracking on treatment-related outcomes, as well as long-term recidivism goals. So first is to really assess for risk. So we're using a standardized validated risk need assessment tool to identify the extent and nature of the problems or the criminogenic needs. Those are things that we're going to want to specifically focus on and when we're targeting the criminogenic needs for treatment. So we want to identify those that are the highest risk areas and focus on those and kind of build our case action plans and treatment plans around prioritizing those that have the highest risk. And this really allows us to determine the course of treatment, which we can use the information from the risk need assessments to identify the amount, frequency, and duration of the treatment that would be necessary, at least based on what we know in the empirical literature, to be most effective in reducing recidivism. In doing this, there are a number of things to consider about treatment dosage and intensity. First, the research has demonstrated that too little of duration and intensity might not be associated with risk reduction. So it's meeting that kind of threshold that we know, or at least has panned out in the research that seems to work. And obviously, this is going to vary across different risk levels. Secondly, there is evidence that would suggest that too much treatment services may be associated with an increased risk of recidivism. So again, this is important to consider. We don't want to put someone through too many services or too much services to the point to where it actually has a negative effect, at least in terms of their likelihood of recidivism. And along these two lines, there's a point of diminishing return. So there's kind of this mesh point that's kind of been bore out in the research, and that's that we know that depending on what someone's individual risk level might be, that there's a certain window or target number of hours of treatment that we should be using or kind of targeting to have the greatest impact on reducing recidivism. I think once we start kind of going beyond those based on the corresponding risk level is when we might see some diminishing returns. So there's a saturation effect. And then obviously there are other points to consider, such as what do we want to count? Is this the length of treatment, number of hours in treatment, the concentration, the number of treatment targets, or just increased difficulty? I think in some regards, we tried to put together in this example spreadsheet a number of things that start to get at some of these various areas. And then lastly, kind of a very important question that was discussed a bit last week is what actually counts? I mean, are we interested in attendance, participation and engagement, the types of interventions, the types of activities, and even considering what portions of treatment, of treatment that is actually treatment. So obviously there's some introductory or kind of housekeeping rules that might be discussed in the beginning. Are we counting these things as treatment? So again, if we need to kind of revisit those, we can at the end if there's some questions, or if there's specific questions related to your agency, we'll be glad to kind of address those. If you email us at ucjc@utah.edu with those questions, we'll be glad to answer them. Otherwise, feel free to share in the chat box. So again, that's just a brief introduction into what we covered last week. Moving forward, oops, apologize for that. I'm not sure what happened there. For the specific example that we're going to cover today, we showed or shared with you all last week an example of an Excel spreadsheet. And I just wanted to note that this is a template. This is by no means the gold standard of how agencies should think about structuring their data or tracking data on treatment. These are just some important areas or fields, different variables or data points that are worth considering when tracking treatment and thinking about the impact of treatment on recidivism. Again, I think that ultimately the spreadsheet was designed to help visualize what treatment targets, dosage, and and treatment dosage and intensity, and even starting to get at some issues of fidelity. Again, there are program-specific or program-level fields in the spreadsheet, as well as individual fields in the spreadsheet. And just as a note, I think it's always important to consult with an internal research team and or external evaluators if you're using this information to actually kind of link it to recidivism outcomes and down the road. If you're going to do some evaluation studies on your treatment services and the relationship with recidivism, I think it's important to consult with your internal research team and external evaluators before you start kind of getting too far in the weeds on setting up or structuring a data system or even using this. Maybe there are certain ways you want to tweak it that are going to be beneficial for an evaluation team down the road. And in this example that was provided to us, Utah Department of Corrections Excel program provided some de-identified data for 5 clients. Again, really appreciate them providing us that, specifically Dana and Debbie for their work on retrofitting their data to the spreadsheet, and then also providing some additional data to track treatment more closely at the individual level. That being said, I want to stop sharing and then share the spreadsheet. Hoping everyone can see that. If not, please comment and let me know. So the first tab here really just lays out client information and their specifically their risk need assessment information, as well as kind of the general program start and end date. I think here I bolded the LSR&R because that's what's the information that's used within this example is specific to the risk needs levels and scores that were identified using the LSR&R assessment. I think if you're planning to use this for treatment, this spreadsheet was designed with the idea in mind that the agencies are going to be using those standardized validated risk need assessment tools. So you'll see some of these different fields that we're tracking would be important for to include, especially when we're thinking about case planning or treatment decision making. Here we can see that we got some information on several different clients, mostly higher intensive risk and the accompanying risk scores. We asked, or in the spreadsheet here, to provide the top 3 needs, criminogenic needs areas that were identified based on the risk need assessments. And you can see that they vary a little bit from person to person. But again, this is always something good to kind of think about when you're structuring a case plan. There's been a very limited bit of research that would say you want to target those high priority areas first. You know, those are going to be the most important areas to work on if we're thinking about having the greatest impact on reducing recidivism in the long term. So again, these are just an example here. We have got family, marital, antisocial thinking patterns, companions. Here we've got substance abuse. You know, so, but it looks like some overlap across these 5 individuals. And obviously just the program start date and end date. Looks like a few are still in the program and one's kind of in a stuck status, if you will. The next tab really focuses on the total hours spent in treatment here. I think, you know, depending on the data systems that the agencies have, this might be something that's easily obtainable, or you can use, you know, if you were using this spreadsheet, for example, you could use tabs 2B and 2C and kind of put that information together to build out this total. But again, this just gives us a sense of the total number of hours spent in treatment to this point in the program. I think that from this information, you know, we can start to dig a little bit deeper and even create some additional columns if it was necessary to see whether these individuals are tracking in the right direction in terms of their trajectory to hit like treatment benchmarks, depending on the risk level. So if we're, you know, aiming for 6 to 9 months of treatment services, and say, for example, this person's at 76 and they've been in for you know, 4 or 5 months, you know, it might not be that they're going to hit that benchmark of 300 hours by the end of that kind of 6 to 9 month window. So again, it's just something to think about. Again, this just provides a little bit of context as to the total amount of time spent in treatment to this point. This tab, tab 2B, is really getting at the interventions by client. And as I mentioned, I think that this is a template. I think that there are other ways that this could be structured, you know, if we're thinking about for an evaluation purposes. But again, I think the information is here, and that's something that can always be discussed, you know, with an evaluation team or a research team, whether that's internal or external evaluators. But again, most of this information is copied from a previous tab, so tab 1. I'm not sure what happened here, but 420 and 471, they do have, I can just paste these over really quick. You can, oh, there it is. Not sure what happened. You can see that the 3 priority areas that we asked for are listed there. And we can start to see the specific interventions that were used to target these criminogenic needs. And the total hours of time spent in an intervention per week, the number of weeks that the client was in the program, and then the total number of hours in an intervention over the program. I think, you know, another way to think about this is we could have client 864 listed each time that they're in a different program, what that program is specifically targeting, and then that line would be specifically, you know, individual to each of those different programs. So just a different structure to this. That would allow you to kind of see the total number of hours spent in each individual intervention. Whereas right now, given the format that we sent out, it's only obtainable at the aggregate level. So we know that this individual is spending on average 4.75 hours of time in these various interventions in a given week. And again, we can see that if we do some multiplication here based on the number of weeks that the client was in the program, we get that total of 76, which was listed here in this tab. The next tab is determining treatment quality. This is more of a program level type tab. So again, I had mentioned earlier that there's some individual level data that we're collecting, but also some program level data. This is a nice kind of reference table, I think, that highlights the various interventions that were mentioned in the previous tab in 2B, but also might be just the full array of services that this program has to offer. And it's important that we start to think about this and the various targets of each of those individual interventions. I think that, you know, a lot of interventions aren't specific to one specific criminogenic area or need. They might kind of tackle both, or some might be open to kind of tweak to specific different criminogenic needs. So again, I think, you know, it's important to kind of map these out a bit. Again, we just kind of want to get a sense of whether these things are group sessions or tailored toward group interventions or individual interventions. What the number of attendees are. This could also be tracked, you know, individually or per week by the group. This could be tracked in a number of ways. But again, as we sent this out, it was just made, you know, kind of one line per different interventions. So on average, they're saying that the number of attendees is pretty much in this range of 4 to 10. You know, and this could be revised. And just tracking the number of facilitators. There's some work that's been done in the correctional research that, you know, after 10 attendees, you know, you need a second co-facilitator, needs to be actively engaged. So again, this kind of starts to get at that, and you can start to unpack that to see if your programs are operating, you know, within core correctional practices or best practices based on the research that you know is out there. This is more of kind of getting at fidelity or how the group is being conducted, and that's whether, apologize for that. Oops, not what I intended to do there. So whether group observations have taken place, I think that this is an internal data field that can be used to see, like, hey, do we have you know, program directors and or other kind of you know, administrative staff that are clinicians as well, that are sitting in on group observations and taking note of what's taking place in these. So again, this is something just to kind of gauge whether you know, whether groups observations are taking place within your different groups or interventions, as well as thinking about, you know, what that means in terms of the program. And then lastly, the number of minutes that was spent completing the intervention. I think that this kind of gets back to what Christian was talking about in the last session, which is what counts. You know, so this field was specifically designed to get at the number of minutes that was actually spent completing the intervention. So this could be, as you see, if this was an hour-long intervention, 60 minutes, that they're only capturing 50 minutes of that as being delivering the intervention, because 10 minutes are dedicated to kind of, you know, hello, general kind of notes, housekeeping rules, so forth. The third tab here is the only new field that we're adding to this tab was the number of role plays per week. So there's some emerging research, you know, that we'll gladly share with you at the end of this session, that has identified the number of role plays that individuals receive per week has been associated with enhanced recidivism outcomes. So it's probably important that these things are being tracked, especially if we know that they're in a number of programs that should be receiving or, you know, integrating role plays into the curriculum. So again, we can just see if those things are lining up. But again, you know, this is really the only new field here. And we would expect that depending on the duration and intensity of services that are being offered, some of these things might be higher for those higher risk or intensive service or needs clients. And then lastly, again, this is more of a program level tab here. This is just to help serve as a reference or an overview of the different interventions that you have, or that have you know, that you can utilize in your program, and what those targets are of the intervention, again, whether these are group or individual. And some of this information can be obtained from the previous slide on treatment quality. the number of attendees. But the new kind of information here is how many times during the intervention did the client role play. So it's getting a little bit more specific in terms of what that specific curriculum or intervention is designed to do. And then really starting to think about, like, okay, if the intervention is designed to have 1 to 2 role plays per session, you know, how many of the participants actually completed the role play? So it's starting to drill down a bit more on kind of some program level specifics related to treatment that have important implications for treatment services and their I guess their success in reducing recidivism. So I've got just a few minutes here. I'm going to stop sharing and share another file that was provided to us from the Excel program. And this is just a way that they're using the information from those, you know, from the different tabs in the spreadsheet that we just shared with you to kind of start keying in a bit more on the specific high priority areas and what does the dosage and treatment intensity of services look like, you know, specifically for an individual. So, you know, if we're thinking back to the previous slide, there was, you know, this client 864, and these were on the left column here. These were the different risk need areas that were identified. We can see that companions was rated very high. The antisocial pattern was also rated very high. Family marital was rated very high. And they actually included substance use here, and it was rated as a low risk area. So if we're thinking about that, I think that this just really helps us visualize where those services are being rendered, what areas they're targeting, and do they kind of align with what we would expect based on the priorities. So for example, for this person, we would probably expect to see visually that these very high areas would have had the overwhelming majority of the treatment sessions that are being tracked here. But instead we can see that this low risk area is kind of the one that's being paid more attention to. And while that's not necessarily a bad thing, I think that just goes to show that sometimes kind of visualizing these things or mapping these out or using data might help us hone in on things that we can improve as a program. You know, where we really want to focus our efforts are these high risk areas, and you know, it should be reflected in the treatment related data. And you can see that they provided that for some of the other examples. You know, again, this one seems to kind of fall in line with what we would expect here, very high. And there are obviously different ways that this information can be conveyed or tracked internally. And I think that there's, you know, it's just important to consider what works for you, but also what your end goal is. If you're going to evaluate this or have, you know, an internal research team evaluate this, they might want to have some say in how the data are structured, as well as if you're planning on partnering with an external evaluator to examine how this data can be used to kind of examine recidivism outcomes. It might be important to have them weigh in. So with that being said, I think we have about 5 minutes left, and I apologize that there's a lot of information here. So if you have questions, please send them to us directly, either at ucjc@utah.edu or in the chat function. And Jessica is going to join us now, and we're going to try to address some of those questions.
So sorry, yes, just coming online here. All right. So I am just going to step back and cover over some group observation quickly. It's a resource that you'll be getting by email. So I'm going to take over the screen sharing here. And let's just make sure I pick the right window here. So, excuse me. So this is taken from Dr. Latessa, Dr. Johnson, and Dr. Ketzel's second edition of What Works and Doesn't in Reducing Recidivism. And I've worked with some programs talking about, okay, when we're doing group observation, when we're looking at dosage, what are some of the questions or what are some of the areas that we want to ask? Now, coming from a lens of program evaluation, we use the correctional program checklist, which does come from this team. And they offer in their text some really great questions. So just highlighting, feedback should be given for group delivery skills. It's an important tool in monitoring program delivery and quality assurance. And I like how they say here that group observation should be done at least once during the cycle of the curriculum. So you can see a list of questions here. I'm not going to read those through with you today, but I'll make sure that you are receiving them by email and will continue to be available so that we can discuss how you may select some of these questions or what specific questions you're trying to get at with using your program data, looking at your groups, and sort of considering all of this information that we've presented here today. That leads me into just reminding folks we have one more event in this series. Christian Sarver, Dr. Sarver, will be leading us through a discussion of this text. So we've sort of presented case planning with Dr. Salisbury. Our group has covered using data, and we're going to wrap it up by stepping back and looking at what works and doesn't, and looking at the text closely. If that's of interest to you, please consider joining us. The final event of the series will have the authors join us and be able to field some of your context-specific, community-specific questions. So I hope that will be useful. Again, I'll make sure that this link and such are available to you by email. One of the questions, if you're doing group observation, who do you suggest to do the observation? Someone that's not involved with the agency or the agency? I think that question bias is a reasonable question. I'll also let Dr. Sarver and Derek come in here, but I think that there's a benefit to both. You want internal quality assurance measures in place, watch with different staff. I've heard of peer group peer observation formats, as well as supervisory or leadership observation. It depends on if there's clinical observation and supervision happening, or if it's around a curricula and following fidelity measures for that curricula. But then you also have that program evaluator, that outside look. And I think that adds something to it, but it's not necessarily the best way or the only way that it should be done. There should be some internal quality assurance measures, for example, group observation that are happening in your program.
I would agree, Jessica. I think for a regular kind of, I apologize for my cat, by the way, he's being part of this. I think the most important thing is to develop an internal structure whereby staff are getting consistent observation and feedback from peers and or a supervisor. In that case, I wouldn't worry so much about fidelity. It's really about a training and feedback process. I think a program evaluation is kind of a different lens on your program that would be helpful. But in this case, I wouldn't be so worried about bias. I think it's just more the capacity for people to kind of have someone say like, hey, Jessica, you did a great job on that, but I noticed you didn't touch these 3 points. It's really important that we touch those. Or I think one of the biggest things that we see is people hate role playing. And if you hate it and are uncomfortable with it, it's hard to do it in a way that's useful. So having some feedback on like how you do a role play or better ways to do a role play or strategies for making the role play useful. And a program observation that we did one time, actually, the best role play I've ever seen, it was in a juvenile program. And the case manager started the role play in this kind of like high level, funny, goofy, like, okay, we know this is silly level, and the kid did it, and then just kept running it through different ways. And the case manager was role playing as the parent and kind of got increasingly more difficult and parental as the role play went. But it's something that I would never have thought of. And I think seeing that, I was like, okay, this is the kind of thing that you would want someone to get feedback or assistance on as you're observing people. Sorry, that was a long answer.
Yeah, and just to come back to that, I think when we're looking at data collection, if you're implementing a particular intervention and you're wondering if it's working well, you also want someone in the room to be able to say, oh, the warm-up is taking longer than I would anticipate it taking, and being able to give that staff person some feedback about, okay, it took about 30 minutes to move into the intervention. So that's going to impact our dosage and the change that we can anticipate to see. So I'd really like to recommend that we work on that introductory process with you. So that's one way that an internal group observation can be really, really supportive and helpful.
I know we're at the end of our time, but I want to touch on Debbie's comment as well, particularly for those of you who are working in institutions or residential treatment settings, right? Obviously, if a client is incarcerated, the substance use the score as collected on the LSR&R is going to drop because they haven't had the opportunity to use, but you obviously want to keep a lens on how does substance abuse tie to this person's criminal behavior, right? So it makes sense that even though the person had recently been assessed as low as substance use, you know that actually is a big driver of that person's criminal behavior. So I just want to thank Debbie for adding that context.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. Please consider joining us for the final event of our kind of fall virtual event series. We're available at UCJC at utah.edu. If you'd like to submit data or talk about any questions that came up that we didn't have time to cover because this event is so short. Thank you to Christian, Derek, and for all of you for joining us. The follow-up event is in December. It starts on the 2nd and it runs Wednesdays from 1 to 2 p.m. I'll make sure that you all receive the flyer and the link to sign up by email, as well as the other resources like the CEU quiz from today.
And I just want to follow up. I know some of you have sent us data that we didn't get to today. We will be following up with you. And as Jessica said in the chat, if anyone is interested in discussing your data with us, having us discuss your data with you, oh my gosh. Even if you don't have that data in a format yet, you just want to talk through ideas about collecting it, please reach out to us at the email that Jessica posted. Otherwise, I hope you all have a great day. It's nice to see you, or not see you. Talk to you via chat.